Can I ask you a question? When you say know your spouse, is that how you would define knowing your spouse?
I would say, understanding your spouse's identity in the eyes of God.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah. I'm not talking about favorite color or, a predilection for high heels or, for sports cars or what the favorite sports teams are or whatever. I'm talking about, do you see your spouse as God sees your spouse? And there's the primary reason why Catholics and others don't know their spouses very well. One primary reason is that they don't know themselves very well.
Hey, thanks for joining us on today's podcast. We are glad you're here. This is an interview that I think will cover a lot of topics and fill in some gaps, particularly as we look at our marriage and how what we can bring, if you will, how we can improve and strengthen our marriage.
I'm just excited because I've been starting to follow Peter's work and the whole idea of the parts that are within us, and that we are a reflection of the Trinity, when the Trinity is basically in relationship, and that we're in relationship with ourselves. And we have to learn how to do that to effectively be in relationship with other people. Yeah. Anyway, so this is something on a personal level that we've been kind of like going into and thinking about and praying about. And so we are excited to share with you this interview with Peter, because we've been just really blessed by just his excellence in his field as a Catholic psychologist. So,
all right, before we get into that topic, today's topic with Dr. Peter Malinowski, we are going to be out traveling, and we say this all the time, but when we are out, we would love to meet you. If you happen to be in any of the places we're traveling, we were at Apostolate for Family Consecration, the Catholic Family Fest, in August. We're going to be there, and then we're going to be in Florida.
Yeah,
right? And then
we'll be in Florida for 2 different events in Jacksonville, in that area, and St. Augustine.
And then we've got Rua Woods, which we've mentioned before.
Rua Woods in
Cincinnati, Ohio. And they have their big gala event, and we'll be speaking there. We'd love to see you.
And it's a great organization for you to support. So if you're in the Cincinnati area, go check it out.
Awesome. All right, well, let's jump into the conversation with Dr. Peter Malinowski. He has both some great podcast resources out there, as well as running Hearts and Souls, right, is the organization, and a ton to unpack in today's conversation. All right, Dr. Peter Malinowski, welcome to the program. We are so happy you're with us. And, I have been familiar with your work for a while through your podcasts and through the work that you do in internal family systems. But we got to meet in person not too long ago, and it's really been a pleasure to get to know you a little bit. So thanks for coming on the program.
It is a pleasure and an honor to be here. I've been following your work for a while. In fact, it was Father Boniface Hicks that first let me know about you, because I was asking.
Father Boniface is a great networker.
It's like, wow. I said, who knows something about parenting? Because I kind of live in a little hole under a rock in some ways when it comes to what's out there. And it's been great to kind of to follow you in a number of ways, and then to encounter both of you when we were together not that long ago. So,
well, thank you so much. That's a real honor for us to hear you say that, because we really respect the great work you're doing with Hearts and Souls, and just with internal family systems. And just, I feel like the world needs more Catholic psychologists, or I'll put it this way, psychologists who are grounded in a true Catholic anthropology. In our work, we see the great need for healing and wholeness in the lives of parents, so they can raise holy and happy and healthy emotionally and whole WHOL, whole people. So thank you so much. And so we're so excited, because I really believe that this conversation is going to serve our parents. And that's why we invite people on the show, is because I feel like we can express our own thoughts and the ways that, that your work has affected us, but it's so much better to have you on. You're explaining yourself.
And before we get to the heart of everything, could you just share briefly just how you ended up as a Catholic psychologist,
Yes.
right?
Sure.
How did you end up in this crazy world in some ways?
No pun intended.
Yeah, no. When I was in high school, I had an interest in psychology, took a psychology course, high school psychology course, but I didn't take any psychology courses as an undergraduate.
Interesting.
And really where I came back to is I experienced some of my own trauma that had obviously psychological and emotional and relational elements to it, but also spiritual elements to it. So like many psychologists, I was trying to figure out my own experience. And in a sense, I made a vow, like this will never happen again, right? I'm never going to get hurt again. So I kind of entered into psychology from a kind of defensive position. And I had seen things in my family, that I said, I don't ever want that to happen to me. I don't want to struggle with those kind of problems. So I came in with a real focus on the spiritual dimensions. How do we ground the practice of psychology in a Catholic anthropology, like you were talking about? How do we look at human formation? Because when I entered into graduate school, Pastores Dabo Vobis had just come out. And that was the first document that really spoke, St. John Paul II really spoke about human formation for the first time.
Right. And that was towards priests primarily, right?
Towards seminarians and priests, right.
Okay.
But it was it was sort of the first time that the church was really starting to focus on this natural level in a more ongoing way. And so, I was very primed to, and I really struggled. I almost left the field of psychology because I couldn't, at that time, the only thing that was around was the Catholic Social Scientists organization. Yes. There was no Catholic Psychotherapy Association. It didn't exist way back then. Divine Mercy University or the Institute for Psychological, that didn't exist. There wasn't anything out there for psychologists. There was a counseling program at Steubenville at that point, I believe. Right. But there was very few resources. Yes. And so, I just felt like there's got to be a way to bring this together. And that's what I've spent my career trying to do. And I was also really interested in the unconscious, not just about what you could see on the surface, not just the part of the iceberg that's visible above the water, but most of that's going on, that's below the water. Because that's the part of the iceberg that sinks the ships. True story. So I really wanted to see, could we be doing a better job? And the other thing that I believe, there are a number of organizations that look a lot at surveys. Pew does a lot of this. Like, why do people leave the church, right? And they never ask the right question. I think it all boils down to one primary answer, and that is they don't believe the church will meet their needs. Mm-hmm. If you want to boil it down to one main reason why people leave us, it's because they don't believe the church will meet their needs, which means nobody in the church is attuned to them. Nobody in the church has showed them the love of Christ. Nobody in the church has resonated with the things that they're deeply struggling with. And I have an example of this. Like, I'm just going to share something which, kind of really informs a lot of my thinking about this. There was an author named Lancelot Law White. He wrote a book in 1960 called The Unconscious Before Freud. And I mentioned that the unconscious is huge for me. Like, I think that's where so much of this stuff is happening. And he said, quote, the general conception of unconscious mental processes was conceivable in post-Cartesian Europe around 1700. So 1700, people are starting to think about the unconscious. It was topical around 1800. So 1800, people are talking about it. Right. And fashionable around 1870 to 1880. It cannot be disputed that by 1870 to 1880, the general conception of the general idea of the unconscious was a European commonplace, and many special applications of this general idea had been vigorously discussed for several decades. So by 1880, this was a big deal in the major centers of Europe. By 1915, that's before Freud started writing, by the way. 1915, Freud publishes his monograph, The Unconscious. Right. But it's not until 1952 that the Vatican even ever mentions the unconscious. All right. So 250 years after it's conceivable, 150 years after it's topical, 3 generations after it's fashionable to be discussing something as important as the unconscious.
Right.
We don't have any mention of it. And that was Pope Pius XII. He was talking to a bunch of basically neurologists. And a lot of it was cautions about the unconscious because, there was some pushback against what Freud was saying. It all makes sense and all of that. But if we don't meet the human natural needs that people have, because human formation is the basis of all formation, according to St. John Paul II, if we don't address that, then we're going to be trying to build our spiritual edifice on an unstable human formation foundation. So that's what my career is all about. And I think there's some other developments that have come up. This isn't just about the unconscious. There's some other developments that have come up that could really, really help people. And it's not just about their psyches. It's also about how they can enter into a deep, personal, intimate relationship with God, the Father, with Christ as our shepherd and our friend, with the Holy Spirit, with also with the saints, right? Our Lady and so forth. So that's what I'm passionate about. And that's what kind of keeps me going.
Well, see, that's exactly
I love your
what
passion, by the way.
Exactly what you're saying right now is why I felt such a kinship with you in hearing you speak, because what I hear you saying is that it's not just like, oh, my Catholic spiritual life is over here.
Right.
And then my psychological health is on this side.
Right.
And my
Right.
work is... No, that's not the way it works. We are one person.
Right.
And that's what we see in our work, and what we want to help bring out to parents is that you can't say, oh, here's my career over here, and here's my parenting over here, and here's my marriage over here. No, you are all one person. And what struck me about what you're saying about when people leave the church, they don't believe the church will meet their needs. It's so interesting because it's not that they don't believe Jesus will meet their needs. Maybe they do believe in Jesus, but you know what? They're going to meet Jesus in the Protestant church.
Right.
They don't believe the actual physical people in the church will meet their needs. And that's really where the rubber hits the road. It really is that. And we as Catholics, we're so incarnational. We should get this. We should totally get this.
We should be on the cutting edge, the leading edge of this. We shouldn't be following behind. We shouldn't be, enamored with, things that were popular in the 70s and the 80s in the Catholic Church, or in the broader community, I mean. So yeah. And we also get to cheat. We can cheat because we have divine revelation. We have what we know to be true by the authority of the church, but the problem is that it hasn't been translated very well. And again, to be fair to the hierarchy, to the bishops, to the popes, this is not their thing. This is not, I don't expect, that we're going to have, bishops and cardinals and priests and popes that are going to be experts in everything from neurobiology to psychology to sociology to, all of the different fields that contribute to human formation.
Yeah.
And in fact, ever since Vatican II, and from long before then, if you go back to St. Augustine, for example, he talks about in De Doctrina Christiana, this is in the 4th century, he's talking about despoiling the Egyptians of all of the good things that they have and sanctifying them, bringing them into the church, right? Bringing in, anything that they have of value. St. Thomas Aquinas was the great synthesizer. It wasn't just Aristotle that he was drawing from. It was everybody that had anything useful to say, for the salvation of souls. And so I take the same approach when it comes to non-Catholic approaches to everything from trauma to flourishing, right? And everything in between. Like, how do we draw this in, and how do we claim it for our own use? Because anything that keeps you from relating deeply on the natural level will also keep you from relating with God at a deep level, right? So many spiritual problems are really not in the spiritual realm. They're spiritual consequences of human formation deficits. They're not. And so we use the spiritual means, and I have so many people, I've gone to confession, I've gone to spiritual direction, I've done all this Lectio Divina and spiritual, but they're not understanding that this is something that requires or that at least God would have us use natural means to resolve, because he likes it when we use natural means to solve natural level problems. But again, people often would much rather have a spiritual problem. It seems more noble to have, a dark night of the soul than to have a clinical depression or something, right? So. Yeah.
Well, but and that means that it requires more of us, right? That it does.
More work.
There's work to be done. And that we have some of it, because I feel like that in the realm of counseling and psychology, there is this, one, you experienced it early on, this dichotomy of worldviews, this clash of worldviews from a secular counselor. But then even as Catholics approach it, right, that we come into it, are we bifurcating? Are we keeping things distinct and separate? But that there really is something we can do, and that we are not merely a victim of even the things that happen to us. We can work through our life, right? And I don't know if you would say that a lot or all of your work is now kind of focused in on a particular approach to counseling, or is that, would you say, how is internal family systems?
Right, internal family systems. Yeah, so I've been trained in a lot of different approaches to psychotherapy and to living in general, right? I'm sort of an omnivore when it comes to that. And so, in my training originally was in cognitive behavioral therapy, and I also had some background in health and rehabilitation psychology. And then I spent a long time going deeply into psychoanalytic approaches, and then EMDR and some interpersonal approaches and so forth. And then it came to me as I was really working with some deeply traumatized people. These were folks that had been sexually trafficked, sometimes by their parents, like terrible. And I was like, I am dealing with parts. Like I'm dealing with, there are multiple personalities here, because some of these folks would have met the technical criteria for multiple personality disorder, or what we call DID. And I've got to figure this stuff out about parts. And I had been trained in a model that really emphasized personality assessment. And in that, you emphasize there's one personality. You're looking to describe the single personality. And I was writing reports that would try to combine all these different elements, right, that didn't hang together very well. And I'm like, and so when I ran across internal family systems, I said, oh, this is really interesting. And then I started to look at all the sort of parts and systems approaches, because there's a number of them. And what I really liked about internal family systems is that it had a hierarchy within. In other words, there's an innermost self in addition to there being parts, which is kind of unusual among parts and systems approaches to understanding the human person, even if they appreciate the multiplicity. But what really got me, Mike, was when I was like, oh my goodness, I have parts, oh my goodness, here we go, and so it just opened up a whole new world for me personally. And so it isn't just something where, I'm going to get this tool and I'm going to put it in my toolkit and I'll use this tool on my clients or something. This was like much more of a way of thinking about the human person. What IFS offered were vast improvements on understanding the human person and the human experience.
Okay.
That were better than the other things I could find.
Right.
And so that's why I was so drawn to IFS.
Yeah. And so when I first heard internal family systems, I thought ignorantly that, it's a way of parent-child relationship.
I'm sure a lot of people think that, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, wait, it's talking about that I am one, right? That I essentially, I assume it was from the very genesis, right? That it was internal family systems, meaning that inside of you, there are child, and there are different parts of you. Much like we talk about in Scripture, we are one body but many members. Right. But what you referenced is that IFS isn't necessarily a deeply Christian or Catholic.
No, it didn't have its origins. It didn't have its origins in Catholicism or Christianity at all. Where it came from was Richard Schwartz, and he was a family therapist, right? And he was finding that when he was doing family therapy, he could see that that there was actual change in the family members, but family members were still reacting to each other with the old template, right? Or the old model of the family. The old man. And so what he realized was that people internalize their external families. In other words, there's parts of them that take on the qualities and characteristics of parts of the significant others in the family. Let me give you an example, because this can be a little hard to grip onto. So if you know as a 5-year-old that mommy gets really angry if you leave the lights on, in your bedroom, right? A part of you, in order to avoid mommy's frustration and anger, because you've got to preserve that relationship, a part of you will get hard on you, can get critical of you if you forget to turn the lights off. So that part of you is sort of taking on the role of mommy so that you can avoid conflict in that critical relationship. And so there's ways that we internalize, and parts take on roles that are meant to be, and actually are in a number of ways, adaptive at the time that those roles are taken on, but they're not adaptive later. Like because you're no longer 5, you're now 25 or 35 or 55, right? And mommy's not there, right? And and maybe mommy is like grown out of that, but that part is still stuck at the point where you're 5. Yeah. And so what this does is it so much brings in a number of things, the multiplicity, which allows us to relate with ourselves, which, by the way, we have by being made in the image and likeness of God. We're not just made in the image and likeness of God the Father. We're not just made in the image and likeness of God the Son. We're made in the image and likeness of the Trinity. And so that implies that we have the capacity for relationship within us. Yeah. Right? Just like God has the capacity for relationship within him, right? In fact, the relationship between the Father and the Son, the love there, and I want to be careful here because Trinitarian theology can, but proceeds from the Holy Spirit, proceeds from the Father and the Son, right? Nicene Creed, right? Accurate. Stay safe with that. But the love between the two of them is so powerful that it creates, or not creates, that it begets another person, right? So, and this is something that people don't know, but that, like, for example, from the very earliest times, if you go back to St. Augustine, for example, he says in Sermo 368, he says, if you do not know how to love yourself, you cannot truthfully love your neighbor.
That's right.
All right. And if you do not know how to love yourself, you cannot truthfully love your neighbor. And he didn't have access to Aristotle. He didn't, Augustine wasn't fluent in Greek, and Aristotle was barely known to him. But Aquinas did, and Aristotle said something very similar that Aquinas picked up on and expanded. And basically, Aquinas, he says that the love with which a man loves himself is the form and root of friendship. And so what he means by that is the way that you love others is going to follow the template you have for loving yourself.
Right.
And he also says, he makes an extraordinary claim. You cannot love your neighbor more than you love yourself. And it has a lot to do with the idea that the union with another person, like in friendship, or the union that you have with God, is limited by the unity that you have within yourself. So if you're super fragmented, it's very hard to give yourself in any kind of coordinated, and which is why the title of my podcast is Interior Integration for Catholics. It's all about that interior integration. We changed the name, by the way. It started out as a response to the pandemic. And so I called it Coronavirus Crisis Carpe Diem. But after, 50 episodes or so, we changed the name to really emphasize that this interior integration is not just a spiritual thing. I would argue it's not even necessarily primarily a spiritual thing. It's a natural level thing. It's human. It's a human thing. And St. Thomas Aquinas says that grace perfects nature. Right. It does not destroy it. So it has to have that nature to perfect. So grace helps to perfect that nature, but there's a lot that also has to happen in the natural realm. And ideally that happens in the way that in the families that we grow up with. But we live in a fallen world. There's going to be all kinds of ways that things get derailed. So
right.
I always say this, that, reason we have 10 kids is because we needed to test it out for a little while. And we did set up a counseling fund for our kids. Right?
You've had a lot to learn, over the years. But, I just want to kind of pivot slightly to talk about marriage, because so many of the things that you're saying right here, so resonate. And I hope that our listeners are just applying this, as they're listening. When we have couples who are coming to us who are, like within that first 5 years, getting to know each other, getting to figure out like the dynamics in their marriage and all of that. I mean, we even say to people that before you are, well, first of all, before you're a mother or father, you're husband and wife, right?
Yep.
But even before you're a husband and wife, you're a son and daughter of God.
Right.
And you need to know yourself, like John Paul II teaches us. We have to possess ourselves to be able to give ourselves. And that's what I hear you saying, because that very first primary relationship as a person who is in the married vocation, that primary relationship, human relationship, is with my spouse. Like, this is where I really need to practice loving and receiving the love of God. And it's so caught up with our relationship with God and with ourselves and with our spouse. So I just wonder if you could just kind of draw that out a little bit, which you've been doing. You've mentioned friendship. You mentioned a relationship with God. But why specifically can you just speak
for married couples? Yeah.
For a married couple, is it so important for them to know themselves in order to love their spouse?
Well, so this is where I would nuance or maybe even disagree with you a little bit, Alicia.
Good. Sure, go for it.
So like you said, the primary relationship.
Be wrong. We welcome that.
No, that's okay, and I could be wrong too. Like you said, the primary relationship in the marriage is with the spouse, and I think that's true in one sense.
Oh yeah.
But I think there's an antecedent or a prerequisite, and that is the relationship with yourself.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. So let's get into this. I'm gonna make probably some surprising statements here. So if this rocks some people in the audience, if this sounds off or whatever, I'm just gonna invite you to think through it with us. Okay, like just kind of stay with us. So first of all, I'm going to say that. Well, let me say this first. I have to say this at some point. This is a good time to say this. When Father Boniface Hicks first told me about the work you guys are doing, and I looked it up and I saw, the Messy Family Project. I was like, I like these people already because they get how messy it is. I was thinking about this, the most important things that we do in life are the messiest. They're the least precise. So I have a son. He's a precision machinist. He can take metal and machine it down to 3/10,000ths of an inch. But if he were to say, or if somebody were to say, I love my spouse with great precision, right? I love my spouse with great accuracy in a very tidy and orderly way. If I love my children with great efficiency and with great effectiveness, and my love is very tuned in and exact, it's like creepy and weird. Like it's just like see you kind of like cringing, right? Like who would say that, right? So you guys really get how messy this is and how approximate this can be. And so kind of wanted to start with that. The one main reason, well, let me say this first. I'm backing up. Most Catholic spouses, most spouses in general, do not know their spouses very well at all.
Okay.
They know a lot about their spouse, but I don't believe that they know the spouse well. There are exceptions to this, all right? But, you were going back to, do you hold on to in a very regular way how your spouse is a beloved little son or daughter of God? Like how front and center is that, for you? How integrated is that into your understanding of your spouse?
Can I ask you a question? When you say know your spouse, is that how you would define knowing your spouse?
I would say, yeah, understanding your spouse's identity in the eyes of God.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah. I'm not talking about favorite color or, a predilection for high heels or, for sports cars or what the favorite sports teams are or whatever. I'm talking about, do you see your spouse as God sees your spouse? And there's the primary reason why Catholics and others don't know their spouses very well. One primary reason is that they don't know themselves very well. Okay. Right. And if you don't know who you are, and you've got these real deficits in these three major questions of, who am I and who is God and who is my neighbor, then you're not going to be able to attribute things properly when things go on in a marriage, right? So and so much of this is in the unconscious. So when spouses are fighting, and I've seen lots of spouses fighting, and I've had my share in my marriage too. I've been married for coming up on 29 years, 7 kids. Most of what's going on there is not about what's going on in the present moment. Most of what's going on there is reactions to unresolved issues from the past. Often, usually from before the spouses even ever met each other. Mm-hmm. Because what's happening is not so much that the immediate conflict is so great necessarily, but it's tapping into all kinds of things around shame, around anger, around unresolved traumas of various kinds.
Yeah.
And it's that which is getting activated. And spouses are really great at pushing each other's buttons.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm an expert. You can ask Alicia.
Yeah. No, this is true, right? We need to be honest about it. And it's not because sometimes spouses will do it out of a sense of malice, right? Sometimes, they can be I'm just going to, go after, right? Most of the time, though, it's in a way of trying to protect, trying to create some space, trying to distance, trying to stop whatever's going on in the moment. Because the interpretation is this is going on in the here and now, when so much of it is, and some estimates from some neuroscientists will range that up to 90% is not about the present.
Sure.
It's about what's not connected. It's about what we're not connecting to in the past.
Mm-hmm. All right, can I just, I have a question that, so I do a little like mom circle with members like of our neighborhood every once in a while. And we had this conversation recently with some other women, in this like little mom circle group. And one of the women asked, she said, whenever I don't know how to bring up certain subjects with my husband in a way like that he can receive. Mm-hmm. Exactly that's what it's making me think of. And even just from my own experience, because like you said, sometimes there's a reaction happening and it's not about the present moment, it's about something in the past, but it's also as a spouse, I'm like, but I kind of feel like I need to bring this up because it's something that's important to me, important in our relationship. And I'm afraid to bring it up because I'm afraid of that reaction.
Yep, absolutely.
And in this conversation, I actually wound up saying to this lady, I said to this other mom, I was like, sometimes I feel like there isn't a right way to bring it up. If you say something with charity, maybe there's not a perfect way to say.
Well, what was the right way? What was the right way for Jesus to bring up the Eucharist in John 6 that would not have resulted in so many people leaving? What did he do wrong? Yeah. Right? Where was his mistake in relating with them?
I'll let you answer that question.
There isn't. Sometimes, so spouses' timing is often very off. I will say that because if you are outside your window of tolerance, if you are in the fight or flight, up in that hyper arousal, or you're down in that freeze response or that fawn response where you're in hypo-arousal, it's very difficult for any kind of new learning to happen. Right. So some of it is, you have to pick moments. And so many times what happens when an argument has started and people have left the zone of tolerance, so they start bringing in all kinds of things, and we're going to talk about, basically we're going to bring up all of that. And so some of it is about like operating in the mode of the receiver, as St. Thomas Aquinas says. Can we appreciate when somebody is calm? And appreciate to what degree can they take something in, right? So we want to play the long game. A lot of times this is driven by parsing parts of a spouse saying, I need to be understood. I need to be heard. I need my spouse to respond to me in a particular way. I have an agenda, and I'm going to make that happen, but it's not at all corresponding to the capacities of the spouse, either in that moment or in general. And so sometimes there's a lot of work that has to be done before you can bring up certain topics, because you don't always know how they link back to, so for example, a wife is concerned about a husband who spends money on clothes, right? Money that maybe should be allocated elsewhere, right?
Right.
But that goes back to, when that husband was a boy in grade school, didn't have money, in the family for clothes, took a lot of ridicule for that, activated a lot of shame for him. And so the wife thinks it's about clothes, but for the guy, it's about, oh, you want to take my clothes away. I can't go back to the kind of ostracism, the criticism, the shaming that I experienced because my clothes were substandard in some way, right? And this is a really simplistic example, but that's a
protector
example.
part, right? It's starting to protect the shame and the feelings that he had that are operative in that husband or in that.
But I think that's a perfect example, because then, but the wife at the end of the day, she's like, she may see that and know that, but it's like, but meanwhile, the bank account is being
right.
And it's like, what is she supposed to do?
What is she supposed to do? Well, so what I would say is you approach it differently. Tell me what you like about these clothes. How do they make you feel? Like, tell me, just really getting into the story behind it. Now, this can be hard to do if you're like caught up in your own parts that are saying, we're going to suffer financially when this ship is going down and you're going to be well dressed as we drown. Right?
Because we got parts on both sides going on.
Parts on both sides, and they activate each other, right? And so I will use this example of a husband and a wife in a lifeboat. Okay, so they went out on the big cruise, 20th anniversary. It's just wonderful. The liner goes down, terrible accident, right? They're the two on the lifeboat. The man is busy like stacking up all kinds of provisions in the lifeboat. He's busy, filling it up with food and water and clothes and all of this. And the wife is busy throwing it all overboard, right? And they have the same goal. The parts that they're blended with have the same goal. That is to survive, right? But the guy has been in a lifeboat before, and he's experienced thirst and starvation. Whereas the wife, has been in a lifeboat before that was overloaded and capsized, and she had to deal with sharks, right? So they're caught up in these parts that have this tunnel vision. They're going for the same goal, which is to survive the situation, but they're using completely different means, because when you're caught up in a part like this, you get tunnel vision. The part has a very limited understanding of, it doesn't have a broader perspective. It doesn't understand other people's experience. It doesn't even understand the experience of other parts within you, right? Which is why we want to be more led and guided by our innermost self, why we want to establish that proper hierarchy where the innermost self is leading and guiding the system, because it does have that breadth of vision. So there's always, whenever a spouse is doing something, this is again St. Thomas Aquinas, whenever a spouse is doing something, even if it's really harmful, there's always a pursuit of a perceived good there.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So if we can slow down and we can understand when this guy is buying these nice clothes, and his clothing budget is high, what is the good he's trying to achieve there? Like, what is the good he's trying to seek? Because otherwise what you're doing is basically just trying to take the good away. And the question becomes, how can the need be met in a way that is wholesome and adaptive and good for all the parts? Because if something is really charitable, it's going to be good for all of the parts of all of the people involved. Rather than be agenda driven by a single part that has a very narrow vision and doesn't understand the consequences of what it's doing.
So part of it is just I'm sorry, but just the spouse being curious of looking for what is the real need and asking those questions. I mean, that is something, but asking them in a way of with the humility of knowing, you know what, I don't know what my spouse is thinking because I have done that. I have assumed in my mind, I've said, oh, well, he's doing it because of this reason, you know?
Right.
And then when I bring it up, and Mike would even say to me, why are you assuming that? Like, why are you assuming that's my
Where is that coming from?
motivation
Yeah.
at all? You know? And
yeah.
exactly, where is that coming from? And so I think that each one of us has to have that humility and that is shown in a practical way by asking those questions and being open to saying, you know what, maybe I don't know the whole story here. I know that this behavior is annoying to me, or I see it's damaging to you or to our family or whatever. But okay, let me go deeper and find out. I'm surely they're not doing this to damage our family. Maybe they don't realize it, you know.
Well, but even saying that, right? I mean, saying that out loud, because sometimes we get our tunnel vision and we don't think they're doing it for a good reason, right? I think that's what you're
we assume that they're not, in fact, because when we get stressed, we reduce people down to one or maybe two dimensions.
So true.
Right.
So
he is the one that's putting us in financial peril. That's all the husband's identity now in the mind of the wife is that he is the one that is imperiling us financially and he needs to stop it. Like not thinking about him being a beloved son of God, not thinking about like what is the good he's trying to achieve, not thinking about like what is his history. None of that matters when you're in that place. You are, you know, it's emergency. It's battle stations. It's emergency. We're in a crisis. The klaxons are going off. We've got to stop this now. That's firefighter behavior, right? And so within IFS, that's how we talk about it. And so we need to be able to understand, okay, there's a lot more going on here that doesn't meet the eye. There's a lot that's in the unconscious, you know, and that when we get into that space, our unconscious gets much bigger and our consciousness gets much smaller. So some of it is being sort of calming down like that. I'll give you an example. So I have 3 sons, and as sons do when they hit their teenage years, they will test their fathers. Right. And so
really,
and I, maybe it didn't happen in the Hernan family at all.
Right now in the home.
And I will be the first to admit, I did not handle these situations in anything like a perfect way, because a lot of this stuff happened before I knew anything about parts and systems thinking. So I own my own part in this. But my wife, when it would get intense between my sons and me, right? Yeah. When they were 15, 16, she would get really concerned about abandoning the sons, abandoning us, right? They're going to hate you. You know, you're going to have a terrible relationship. They're going to move away. We're never going to see them again. And I won't be able to love my grandchildren. All right. That kind of a pattern right there. Because there's some history of abandonment and so forth on my mom or on my wife's side of the family. My situation was, if I don't set some limits and boundaries with these guys, they're never going to respect me, and they're not going to trust in authority here. There's got to be a reestablishment of things. And some of the things that are going on could be really detrimental for kids downstream. Right. So there was a real, kind of concern about that. Very different, means, right. Mm-hmm. That, parts would be, prone to. And so, yeah, this is the kinds of things where the stakes seem really high, and fortunately, we were able to sort of navigate that. I was able to take some of the advice and tone down some of my intensity, right. Honoring my wife on that. It's worked out that, that my 23-year-old, he's now 23, my second son, just bought the house to the south of us. And my 25-year-old and his wife and my grandson moving in, because there's 2 houses on that property, so they're going to move in.
That's far from abandoning you, right?
Right, yeah. So it's like, all right, but it was good. It was because we were able to communicate about this, and we were able to sort of modify and take the best of what these parts were seeking for us, but also broaden it out to where the rest of our parts were. Like, because if Pam, my wife, was calm, she could see other points of view on this, and if I were calmer, I could see things other than the need to reestablish, respect and authority in the house, right? So this is the kind of thing where if parents can be on the same page, and they can be equally yoked and they can be pulling together, right, then it makes it so much easier to work with the kids. But in order for that to happen, going back, Alicia, we have to understand ourselves. We have to be in touch with our own parts first. Yeah. and we have to have some integration within ourselves. We have to have that inner unity, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, so that we can have that union with our spouse, so that we can then love our children in a way that's that reflects that union,
right?
That reflects that relationship of husband and wife, that they can trust in, as well as the relationships that they have individually with mom and with dad.
All right, so we've talked about the importance of it, and how do we do that? How do we become more aware and more in touch with our parts? Now, I've done this through both a counseling session. There's a great workbook, but what have you found to be most helpful in people? Because again, as
you mean like practical action?
Yeah, thinking of getting to understand our parts. What's operating here?
What's operating there?
Because I often, I always have a precipitating event, in me that I look at and be like, okay, why did I go from 0 to 60 in this conversation?
Right.
And I get curious and think through what was going on. But for a lot of people, that might be a challenge. What are you talking about? How do we get to know ourselves and the parts, if you will, so that we can deal with ourselves to bring our best selves or our better selves to our marriage?
It kind of depends on where you are.
Okay.
Like so folks that have come from, say, more difficult backgrounds or whatever may really have difficulty accessing that place where their innermost self is, and having their innermost self lead and guide their systems. In fact, in our fallen human world, I argue that most people are really blended and dominated by their parts most of the time. Okay. All right. So I just want to kind of make sure that we're kind of clear about like what we're attempting here. And what parts need is contact with an innermost self. Right. Okay. So there's a number of ways it can do it. It could be your own innermost self. It could be the innermost self of somebody else. It could be a therapist or a coach or a spiritual director or a friend or somebody like that.
The innermost really self is kind of like the conductor, like the main.
Yeah, let me give a couple of definitions, because this would help clear. So the innermost self, and I'm drawing this from a variety of different sources, but the innermost self is the core of the person, the center of the person. Okay. This is who we sense ourselves to be in our best moments, when our self is free and unblended with any of our parts, and it governs our whole being as an active, compassionate leader.
Okay.
In IFS, they call the self the seat of consciousness. There's pros and cons to that definition, but Aristotle would call this the rational part of the person, for example. And so but I would distinguish it from the soul. The self is not the soul. Okay. I think of the self as being in the natural realm, and the soul, having a kind of crossover between the natural and the spiritual realms. And these parts, they feel like separate, independently operating little personalities within us.
Like Inside Out, like the show.
Like Inside Out, exactly. That's a great example, right? Yeah. Each with its own prominent needs, its roles in our lives, emotions, body sensations, guiding beliefs and assumptions, typical thoughts, intentions, desires, attitudes, impulses. They actually have an interpersonal style to them, and worldview. And each part also has an image of God, and an image of self, and images of who my neighbor is. Okay, so these parts, they can feel like the separate persons. They're not. All right, we would say that they have accidental but not substantial form, if we want to get kind of Thomistic about it. They don't exist independently of the person. They don't have their separate souls, although Schwartz would say that. It's not accurate, I don't think. It's not consistent with what we know to be true by divine revelation. But they're more than like passing mood states. It's not just being in a funk.
Right.
Because if you think about even when you're in a funk, that's not just an emotion of being down or depressed. There are thoughts that go with that, beliefs that go with that, impulses that go with that, desires that go with that, worldviews that go with that, a way of looking at God that goes with that, a way of interacting with your spouse that goes with that. It's a lot more than that. And the other thing about these parts is that they endure over time. Right. They're not just when they're front and center and large and in charge. Even if they're in the unconscious, even if you're disconnected with them, they still retain they're still present. They still retain their distinction, and they're still present, and they can still impact you.
Yeah.
So like when people are blindsided by things, like when where did that come from? That came from the blue? No, it came from the unconscious. It came from your unconscious.
And I often feel like when I saw a part come, I'm like, that wasn't me. What
That wasn't me.
And it wasn't as if I had a split personality. It wasn't,
Right.
It
Right.
was simply like, why did I do the thing that I know I didn't want to do, but I got so caught into it,
Romans 7:15, right? Why did I do the thing I didn't want to do? St. Paul, and this is not a question, that's a great point. This is not a question of willpower.
Yes.
Okay? Because of all the saints, St. Paul, strong will. Like this isn't a will thing, right?
Yeah.
He's confused. He doesn't know. Why is it that I do that which I don't want to do, right?
Yeah.
He's asking that question in Romans 7:15. And it's because he's getting, some of this is coming up from the unconscious.
Yeah.
Like he does, that there's parts of himself that he's not in touch with. And so, so what we want to do is going back to your question, Mike, how do we make this practical, or how do we, Alicia, how do we, and that's, well, first of all, understand that there's a different model of human nature than the single unitary homogeneous personality, right? If we are willing to set that aside. And the second thing is to understand, okay, that opens the door for me to be able to love myself and to take that really seriously. There's a lot of debate in Christian circles and Catholic circles about self-love. I talk about this in episode 98 of the Interior Integration for Catholics podcast, where a lot of people are condemning self-love as selfishness or self-absorption or narcissism or whatever. And there's a lot of problems with the languaging around this that I get into in that episode.
Right.
But we know from our Lord himself that we are supposed to love ourselves, because he says in Matthew 22:37-40, these are the two great commandments, right? You shall love the Lord thy God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second one is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the law and the prophets. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? Which means we are supposed to love ourselves, right? And these two commandments, on them hang the entirety of the law and the prophets, right? These are not just like, this is not just sort of, it's a big deal. It's not some obscure dietary requirement in Leviticus. This is like the center, right?
Yeah.
So, and very little has been fleshed out about what it really means to love yourself. Why?
Yeah.
Because I think there hasn't been a model of the human person that shows us how to do that.
Right.
Augustine talks about his divided heart, and he talks about having gotten through it, but it's hard to follow how he did it, apart from knowing that grace had a lot to do with it, right? Okay. Right. You can't just pick up the Confessions and say, this is a roadmap for, for overcoming, whatever vices you might have. So what I would say is, okay, you need to create the time and the space deliberately to begin to check in with your parts. Now, there's a lot of helps you can get with this. You could see an IFS therapist, ideally one that's got a Catholic background. And we have those at soulsandhearts.com/therapists. We have a listing of Catholic IFS-informed therapists there, or a coach. Some spiritual directors, bring in IFS concepts. I'm working with more and more of those in our Formation for Formators community. There's a lot of it's really important to remember that this is not going to be something you can think your way out of. This is not something that you're just going to be able to analytically, conceptually grasp like algebra. And once you get it, you don't go back, because this is a matter of the heart. And so we need to, and what's curative here and what helps us towards flourishing is not just intellectual formation, but it's the experiences in human formation, right? And ultimately what we need is to be loved, because ultimately that's what cures us or heals us, is love.
Right.
Right. So to hold a position of curiosity and openness, and if you can't do that, you bring in somebody to help you.
Yeah.
Now in the Resilient Catholics community, which is, where I bring in the best of all of the approaches to parts and systems thinking, put them into a year-long, structured step-by-step program. Most of that is actually experiential. It's relational. You're working in small groups, and we have also companions. They're not to do the work for you or with you, but to be more like accountability partners, to make sure that to help you, you're doing your parts check-ins every day, checking in with each part each day, that you're doing some part sessions work. And we provide all of the best of the resources out there. And many of them we've developed ourselves to really empower people to do this more and more on your own. Because the idea, even within IFS, is that if you're in IFS therapy, your IFS therapist is your secondary therapist. Your primary therapist is actually your innermost self.
Right.
Because ultimately we have to get there, because there's no one who can love you and love all of your parts in lieu of you.
Yeah.
Not even God can replace the love that you have to have for yourself by just doing it themselves. We've all known people who were deeply loved by God, deeply loved by others, did not love themselves, and
you've
got to have that. You have to have that. It's the third level of the stool,
right,
according to Father Jacques Philippe. Right, he talks about there being a stool of love from God, love from self, love from others.
Right.
And so that's what we do in the RCC. There is not a 10 quick tips of how to do it. Like if I could put this in a single article or something, that would have been a bestseller, right? Yeah. Because it really requires, there's a lot of complexity here. And so that's why the community, the Resilient Catholics community, the RCC exists, is because we bring together, we have about 300, almost 400 people in it who are going through this together. And then there's advanced work that they do as well. We have retreats in August of every year where we get together in person. So that's where that happens. You can check that out at soulsandhearts.com/RCC. But you can get a taste of it in the experiential exercises that I offer in the Interior Integration for Catholics podcast as well.
And it really sounds like the podcast is a great resource.
That is a great resource.
Yeah, people to get
start
started,
there.
If they're interested, and like if they're hearing things and they're like, oh, that could really help me or whatever, they can go. And I think that, didn't you say, or is there a easy introduction? What would the episodes would be?
Episode 157.
Okay.
And this is on YouTube, because we went to video about a little over a year ago, in addition to audio. But you can also, wherever you listen to podcasts, the Interior Integration for Catholics podcast. But episode 157, that is an overview of internal family systems. And then 158 gets into what is the innermost self. 159 are what are parts. And then we go through that all the way through a Q&A in 165, just different aspects. So what is systems thinking? We talk about that. And then starting in 166, we get into what's the justification for this stuff in the Catholic history? Like where, Dr. Peter, do you find this in Scripture? Well, we talk about it in 166. Where is this in the early church fathers, Dr. Peter? That's 167. What about St. Augustine? Does he have anything to say about it? 168. And we're going through throughout all of 2025. All of these different sources, we're going to be mining them, because you can find this in all of these sources. Saint Maximus is a tremendous resource. Saint Evagrius, and so Saint Bonaventure. I mean, there are so many places where we find evidence to support this way of thinking. Now, we don't take it just as Richard Schwartz offered it, though, because he came into this, without, he's not a Christian. He never has been, was raised in kind of a secular Jewish environment, according to his descriptions. But what we can do is we can assume that what the church has given us definitively, to be true, which is what we do in Souls and Hearts. And then we harmonize these other resources to fit that. We don't do it the other way around, or we don't say, they're of equal weight and we'll fuse them somehow. No, we take what we know to be true first, and then we adjust these other approaches to fit that. So it's a modified type of IFS approach, modified ego state therapy, modified DNMS. Like we're drawing from these different resources, structural theory, dissociation. Like we're bringing these in, but we're doing the real human work there. And in order to become a member of the Resilient Catholics community, you have to not just be Catholic and interested in parts and systems thinking, but you have to believe what the church teaches about
Right.
these things. Like it's
Right.
a fidelity to the catechism. That doesn't mean that you have to be anything like a really holy Catholic, because we're not.
Do those even exist?
Yeah, but yeah, you have to. We don't. This is not a place to be getting into doctrinal disputes. We want, as a condition of safety, a felt sense of safety and protection, to know that we're all on the same page, at least intellectually, about what these things are.
We have to kind of have a common language to speak. But
Right. Because you can get on the internet, you can get on YouTube, and you can find a lot of IFS applications, that where they're bringing in a lot of things that would not be consistent.
And that's kind of like why I was so excited to have you on, because I think that there is really people in looking for help for their human formation have to be so careful in looking at secular sources, because they don't always believe the truth. And I even hesitate to say the Catholic understanding is like just what is true. It's just what is true.
What is true? What is true?
Because if it's true for Catholics, it's true for everybody. And I think that we could probably talk forever, right?
I know. There is a lot to unpack here. You talked about the podcast where people can go to get more.
Yes.
You talked about the resilient community.
The Resilient Catholics community. Yep.
And this has been, I'll just, be blunt in saying parts work. I began with a therapist, and now I feel equipped. Although I'm looking into a little bit more with what you guys are doing there to maybe unpack that as well. It changed the way I approach our marriage and the way that I bring myself and say, hey, you know what? When this happened, I realized this is what was going on. Not trying to excuse my behavior, but I wanted you to know this was my intention. This is where I'm going. And I feel like that's where we started this conversation is that parts work, I think, primarily helps us understand ourselves so that we bring our better selves. And then it makes us more aware, because we're just doing that, where we're being more reflective, we're being more curious. We can see, possibly not to diagnose, but to see that there are good intentions that may be going afoul of yours in your spouse, and that it's okay. And then
absolutely
move on there. So anyway, there is a lot that we could unpack, and I'm excited to send. So we'll link in our show both the podcast and the Resilient Catholic community. Any final words as we're speaking to married couples about things that they need to help enrich and make their marriage better?
So going back to that first great commandment, right? To love the Lord your God with your whole heart. That really struck me, right? Because so often we relegate the spiritual life, and Abbot Mark Foley, he's a Carmelite abbot, says there is no such thing as a spiritual life. There's just one life. Like you were saying, Alicia, right? There's just one life. There's not our work life and our home life and our sex life and our spiritual. No, there's one life, right? And but we can invite these parts into that love, loving God more wholeheartedly, loving our spouse more wholeheartedly. The first step in a lot of this is just to get our parts to calm down, relax, step back, let the innermost self come up. That's a good thing. But when the parts are now in right relationship with the self, when they're unburdened from the things that have really constrained them, when they're no longer in extreme roles where they feel like they have to protect, then they can join in the love. Like then you can love your spouse, not only with your innermost self, but also with more and more of your parts. And they each bring their instrument to the music, right? You're right. And then the duet becomes more full, right? The husband and the wife together with more and more of their parts. That's really rare. Most good loving in marriages happens when you're blended. I'm just going to say that, right? Then the next level of love, which is better, a lot better, is that you're blended, but you're blended with parts that still are in some kind of relationship with the innermost self. So they're still like kind of influenced by the innermost self, right? So they're not just totally blended or not just blended with their own agendas. And the next level up is when the innermost self has become to be free to love your spouse. And then the level after that, that's outstanding loving or exceptional loving. And the outstanding loving is when you're loving your spouse with all your parts, like with they're all included, no part left out, no part left behind. And they help you love the parts of your spouse because your innermost self wasn't in the trenches when all the bad stuff came down. It doesn't really understand, I think it doesn't really understand like on its own what your experiences were, because the parts tended to take the brunt of that. And when those parts heal and come back, they still remember, and they help with the empathy, and the compassion and the connection. So your former inner critic can really help with your spouse's inner critic, that kind of thing. So it's not just about the innermost self and figure out all by himself or herself, right? So that's what I would want to leave people with, is that this work in the human formation realm is like learning your human formation arithmetic so that you can do your spiritual algebra.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're still believing that 7 times 8 is 54, even though you may know the quadratic equation, it's not gonna work. Right? So that's what this is all about. That's what we do at Souls and Hearts, soulsandhearts.com. We have a lot of resources. We have all kinds of things, movie reviews from a parts perspective that Dr. Jerry Crete does. We have Kingdom Within that he writes once a month that is all about these things from very high level theological perspective. I write a semi-monthly reflection. Right now we're all talking about identity and from a parts perspective. And then, of course, the podcast, Interior Integration for Catholics, and the communities. We also have a community for formators, right? Because I'm all about the human formation of therapists and coaches and spiritual directors. It's called the Formation for Formators community. And we actually have a retreat that's open in August for folks that are interested in that. It's all on our website. So thank you for being so gracious. I just, so appreciate being here with you guys. So.
Well, we're so happy to have you. Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And and I know everyone is going to take a lot away from this podcast and from your resources. So thank you, Peter, for everything.
It's so good to be with you, Alicia. Mike, thank you.
Okay, so we have some key takeaways for you. I mean, there was a lot in that interview.
Yeah.
And so I tried to pull out 4 main points that you may want to go ahead and think a little bit more about and reflect on yourself. So first of all, kind of started talking about this before, but the fact that we're made in the image of likeness of God, which means that, like the Trinity, we have the capacity for relationship within ourselves. And kind of like following from that, the primary human relationship we have is first with ourselves, and then with God, and then with our spouse and our family.
And just on that note, one thing that I really was struck by was that our I forget the quote, but it was, our capacity to love someone else is our capacity to love someone else is based on our capacity to love ourselves. Right. And I think when we primarily
love your neighbor as you love yourself.
And I it's an ancient quote that he had there, but I'm like, that just makes so much sense, right?
Yeah.
And it's like when we see it hard to love our spouse, that might be true as an external thing, but it also might just be that we've got work to do inside. That's really great. And 90% of the conflicts with our spouse are reactions to unresolved issues from the past. They're not what's happening right now, but they're stuff from the past, which we have found that to be true in
Definitely.
a lot of our relationship as well. And the innermost self is the core person. We're becoming more of students of parts work or internal family systems, but our parts are small personalities inside of us who may be battling within us. And we've got to work on both unblending and really creating an integrated life. And there's a lot more to go into with some of the resources Dr. Peter talked about.
So I really want to encourage spouses to talk about this with each other. And so maybe one question is, how can we begin to see each other the way that God sees us? Because that's really the key to loving each other. And so instead of seeing your spouse through your own eyes, say, Lord, show me, how do you see my spouse? And next, think about a conflict that you've had recently. Then ask your spouse, tell me about why you felt the way that you did. What was rising up in you? Tell me about your feelings when we were having this conflict. So taking the focus off of you, maybe, and what you could have done differently or what you did, and just ask them about their feelings. Like what was rising up, so you can have that empathy, so you can kind of like get inside their shoes and understand them a little bit more.
Yeah. So again, we'll have links in the show notes here. And for more information, visit Dr. Peter's website. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you.